Well, the young man said to the Lord, Lord, what is the greatest of the commandments? And the Lord said, I give you the greatest of the commandments. Never, ever follow Donniel Hartman to the microphone. So Donniel began with 3 jokes, and what was striking is that they're only funny from a point of view. So the first thing Donniel did was put before us, and you understand the procedure here. I'm going to respond for 10 minutes, and Vincent is going to respond for 10 minutes, and then we'll repeat this procedure for the other presentations. By putting the 3 jokes before us, actually what Donniel did was lift up the essential experience of modernity, which is the discovery of what I would call perspectivalism. Things are only funny from a certain perspective. And what human beings have encountered, confronted, and been challenged by in modernity is the arrival of perspectivalism. Some people call this relativism. The idea that there is no single truth standing here or in the possession of someone here. There is a range of perspectives on the truth. No one possesses the truth. We are all pilgrims toward the truth. Well, you know, there are problems with this idea. Pope Benedict warns of the dictatorship of relativism, the reduction of the truth to, well, you've got your opinion and I've got my opinion, and they're both equally valid. Even if you're David Koresh, or even if I'm Osama bin Laden, I have my truth, you have your truth. The modern condition dictates that they're all equally valid. And what people of intense commitment do is they get together at dialogues like this, they take their positions, they're polite to each other, which is the innovation, and they go away, actually not having changed. That's one, maybe a bit of a caricature, one way of describing, as I heard Donniel's narrative, one of the things that the Jews said no to when they said no to Napoleon about singular identity. Can I have a singular identity is another way of saying, is there something true about me that isn't true about you? So in this dialogue, let's put a couple of things on the table. I'm a Christian. I'm a Catholic Christian. Christianity has been defined in its relationship to the Jewish people by the Jewish no to claims we Christians make about Jesus. And that no has generated ferocious responses from us. Why? There's an Islamic no to claims made by Christians about Jesus, which has not generated the same ferocious response. Why is that? When a Buddhist says no to what I believe about Jesus, it doesn't threaten me the way it threatens me when a Jew says no to what I believe about Jesus. Why? And it was the revelation of this structure of anti-Semitic contempt for Jews that made us Christians actually ask this question in a deep way. Why is this no so threatening to us that it has generated 2,000 years worth of assault against the Jewish people? And the answer, of course, is because what we believe is so impossible. And what we believe comes to us from a Jew who was speaking out of a profound commitment to the Jewish tradition. And the custodians of that tradition tell us we misunderstood him. The custodians of the Word of God, in a contemptuous way, St. Augustine called the Jewish people the librarians of the Christian tradition. The librarians, the people who have the knowledge and the history, tell us no. And that cuts us to the core, because at some level, he rose on the third day. He is the Son of God, made flesh, dwelling among us. He is the present sign of God's commitment in love to us. These things we believe can't be true. There's something in us that can't fully believe it. And the Jewish no puts us in touch with that doubt, that fear. Well, modernity is one of those words that goes in two directions. We know the dark side of modernity. The 20th century laid it bare quite powerfully. We know that the myth is that after the religious wars of the 16th and 17th century, the human mind freed itself from the primitive convictions of religious people who had killed millions of people in Europe, especially in that 200-year period, in the name of God. And as a reaction to that, enlightenment, rationality, modernity, people became secular, multiple identities, the rejection of a singular identity. The Peace of Westphalia is the definition of nationhood in Europe based on a particular denominational commitment. But modernity said no to that, which is why the United States of America becomes the ultimate modern culture, because here we are all multiple identities. Our religious note is only one of the notes about us. But that does leave us with a problem. I said a minute ago that modernity goes in two directions. The good direction of liberation from unexamined prejudice, rooted, yes, in religion, and certainly the most powerful example of that has been Christian anti-Judaism, which morphed into Christian anti-Semitism. And in modernity, actually encountering the Jew as a human being, as a person, and this is the theme of my remarks later, a particularly powerful experience of that in the United States, changes the way in which bigotry can possibly work. So in the pluralism of identities, we discover the virtue of pluralism, an essential note of modernity. And pluralism suddenly turns out to be a signal of the rich diversity of creation, not mere mindless relativism. So someone else can believe differently, even about Jesus, even as a custodian of the tradition out of which Jesus comes, without it threatening me. That's the gift of modernity. The other side of it, of course, is if you are a multiplicity of identities, who are you? And that's the theme of Donniel's remarks as I understand them. The invitation out of the Jewish experience to claim a singular identity and be defined by it. Context of pluralism. And it's a kind of radical stance. I suspect that perhaps, maybe especially on Jewish ears, the radical character of what Donniel just said might have fallen more acutely. A challenge to be a Shabbat-observing Jew instead of a Jew who's content to observe the holidays. As a Christian, I hear that challenge very distinctly also. In one way, all of us who are religious are challenged in this way, because secularism is the invitation to let go of any firmly held belief about anything that's not able to be defined scientifically. And we know the virtues of that position. Secularity has been a condition of human liberation since the French Revolution, a precondition of democracy, the arrival of the individual, the arrival of women, the end of the idea of ranking by race or by money, true notions of individual worth. All of this is a consequence of modernity. And yet modernity also leaves us at sea, unless we, in the middle of all this, can still claim to be rooted in one thing. And I would say this is actually the genius of our culture. We're challenged to live up to this. This is the meaning of e pluribus unum. Out of many things, one. Yes, still one thing. I'm a fiction writer, and the fiction writer's job is to move through the levels of what a character wants. Every character wants something. Fiction is character in action. The action is driven by the desire of the character. But the question is, what does the character want most? And how am I, therefore, defined most? Who is God? What is time? Why was I put here? What is the meaning of death? And what is life for? Religion is a set of languages with which to discuss such questions. And my conviction is we can't live a fully human life without the religious language that enables us to address what is beyond language. And in my response to Donniel's invitation, if I were Jewish, I would accept the invitation, I think, to be Shabbat observing in the way he proposed. But as a Christian, I'll accept it in this way, to recommit myself to answer who is God? I am one of those who, in looking for God, sees God in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. And the particularity of that relationship is what defines me as a Christian. But modernity has changed the meaning of that, because now I understand in a way that was impossible before, in part because of having to reckon with the great tragedy of the Holocaust. Now I understand in a way that was impossible before that Jesus, in revealing God to me, does so as a Jew. Jesus never stopped being a Jew. Jesus was not, as I was taught, an Irish Catholic. That means I have to measure every aspect of my conviction and belief as a Christian against the Jewishness of Jesus. And if Christians had been doing this from the beginning, the long sorry story of anti-Semitism would not have unfolded the way it did. So my particularity in that way, because it is a commitment to see God in the face of a Jewish man, is itself an opening to other experiences and other perspectives on the truth. How do I know that the Jewish Shema is authentic and permanent and to be revered by everyone who hears it? Because it was the Shema of Jesus. That's how I know.
Professor Vincent Cornell of Atlanta, practicing Muslim, will get a better introduction when his own presentation comes, but you know what you need to know now. He will give a Muslim point of view on these particulars. Please, Vincent.
All right. First of all, my microphone's on. I can't hear well up here. Okay, good. Thank you. First of all, I'd like to say to everyone, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace be upon you, and the mercy and the blessings of God. That's not just to the Muslims in the audience, to the non-Muslims as well. I agree with this 11th commandment that Jim just gave us about following Donniel. I've done this before, and because of this, I swore I only have 10 minutes, so I'm only going to talk about what I could scribble on one page, but you can see how much is on one page right here. I won't start with the joke, but I will start with some parables, or let's call them analogies, since Donniel ended with them. And these two statements that I want to give you, they, I think, illustrate an important point that he made, that modernity has completely changed the rules of the game when it comes to religion. And these statements are by a person whose European name was Fridtjof Schwohn. Since we have a Swiss theme because of Marty here, he was Alsatian by origin, but he moved to Lausanne, Switzerland, and eventually passed away in Bloomington, Indiana. He was noted as a writer on comparative religion, but he was also a Muslim, and according to his followers, died as a Sufi sheikh, whose name was Nuruddin Isa Ahmed al-Alawi. And he was known for his quips, and a couple of his quips are very important. He once said about modernity, said, "He who prefers the modern world with all of its ease and efficiency to the traditional world as it exists today with all of its ruin and corruption is like a person who prefers a healthy dog to a saint with leprosy." That's something to think about, isn't it? He who prefers the modern world with all of its ease and efficiency to over the traditional world with all of its corruption and disease, if you will, is like a person who prefers a healthy dog to a saint with leprosy. And the point that he was trying to make is that, to a saint with leprosy, the point that he was trying to make is that in tradition, there are vast resources which modernity has caused us to forget. He also said, and this is about Europe itself, when you're in a Gothic cathedral, you feel you're in the presence of God. When you're in a Baroque cathedral, which comes a few hundred years later, you merely feel that you're in part of Europe. Again, something is lost with the passage of time. Now, to be fair, I'm strongly affected by statements like these, but at the same time, I also have to think of a statement that was made by a colleague of mine in religious studies, Professor Peter Oakes from University of Virginia, who's a Jewish scholar. And at a conference a few years ago, he once said, "We are all born into the original sin of modernity." And I think that's a good way to think about our condition, and that may be something that Schwohn had forgotten, because even though modernity has changed all of the rules of the game, it's almost impossible, in fact, it is impossible for us to stand completely outside of it and pretend that we're not part of it and that we're not affected by it. Now, I also was very struck by Donniel's statement about tradition, the traditions we live in, our religious traditions, being defined by the nobility of their aspirations. And he based a good portion of his talk on the biblical passage, "You shall be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." Now, this is one particular passage that has always struck me as a Muslim as important, because that's the way I see Islam as well. What Islam wants of believers is to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. This is why, at least for Sunni Muslims in particular, there is nothing that can really stand as a clergy. Every individual has a responsibility of being a sort of clergyman or even clergywoman, let's say clergy person, because there are also conditions in which women can lead prayers. And we find that accepted widely throughout the Muslim world, at least those among those Muslims who see themselves as Muslims by conviction. Also, it's important to remember, if you go back to the time of the Vietnam War, there's the famous case of Muhammad Ali, the boxer, that was taken to the Supreme Court, in which he wanted to get out of the draft, and he wasn't getting out of the draft. Most people think he did it as a conscientious objector. He didn't try to get out of the draft as a conscientious objector. He tried to get out as a priest of the Nation of Islam, or a minister of the Nation of Islam. The point being, even though he wasn't appointed a minister, as a Muslim, every Muslim believer has a ministerial role, and it was eventually accepted by the Supreme Court. Now, again, modernity changes the rules of the game in ways that are very subtle, in ways that we always or sometimes are unable to see. I think, and we'll see this in the afternoon, I think, in some of the comments I'm going to be making in the afternoon, in my opinion, Muslims have not yet fully recognized how much modernity has changed the rules of the game in a number of ways. And let me give you one example. This is an example from theology. Now, for the Sunni Muslims in the audience, will you all agree that we are still technically supposed to be Ash'ari in our theology? This is what we're taught. This is what I was taught. This is what most Sunnis are taught. Yet, how many of you know anything about what Ash'ari theology really teaches? Probably practically none of you. Okay? Do you realize that Ash'ari theology teaches that the universe is what philosophers call a completely occasionalistic universe, in which things happen not linked by cause and effect but because God wants them to happen? According to Ash'ari theologians, the world is recreated at every single moment in time. Every single moment. Now, that's a good theology to have if you want to believe in miracles, because it makes it easy to justify a miracle. A miracle is nothing so special. As a matter of fact, in the past, in Arabic, the term for miracle was called kharq al-'ada. Literally, it means ripping the fabric of custom, tearing custom. In other words, a miracle wasn't really a miracle. What we think is continuity, what we think are the laws of nature, are not really laws of nature at all. They're just what we're accustomed to be in our experience of the universe. And so when a miracle happens, it seems like the fabric of custom is being ripped. According to Ash'ari thought, this is easy for God. If God is recreating the world at every single moment in time, then a miracle is just simply another creation. He's just kind of throwing something else into the mix. It's no more and a miracle such as the miracles of Jesus are no more miraculous than the miracle of the birth of a human child. It's a beautiful theology on that level. However, if you're an Ash'ari theologian thinking in terms that people thought in the Middle Ages, it's pretty hard to be a scientist in the ways that we tend to think about science, because they completely denied cause and effect. In other words, everything that happens, or for example, it would even technically, my response to Donniel Hartman's talk is not caused by Donniel Hartman's talk. What's happened is that God has decreed that I'm saying what I'm saying close in time to what Donniel was saying, and the two actions really don't have any logical connection other than the fact that maybe God is playing with what's going on here today in this room. On a metaphorical level, sure, this is understandable. But from a scientific level, it's kind of tough to deal with. And I remember back when I was director of the King Fahd Center at the University of Arkansas, I had a Syrian-American student named Aboud who was born in Fort Smith, Arkansas. And I was teaching a course on Islamic theology and philosophy, and I was talking about this. And in the back of the room, because he always used to sit in the back, I had about 30 students in the class, I heard him say, "This is stupid." You know, well, it's an important statement, all right? This is a statement from an intelligent American Muslim college student who had been raised almost from birth thinking that he was supposed to be an Ash'arite, and suddenly realizing it's very difficult to be an Ash'arite today. So if we're not supposed to be Ash'arites, then what are we supposed to be? One of the responsibilities I feel that we have for being born after being born in the original sin of modernity is to, maybe Muslims should think through theology again. Maybe it's time to start, reworking some of the teachings of the Quran and some of the teachings of the traditions of the Prophet Muhammad in ways that might make a little more sense according to the science and philosophies of the time that we have today. So there are, by the way, some people are still trying to make Ash'arism work. What they try to do is get into the level of particle physics and nuclear physics and find anomalies in the physical world that make it work. Another way that modernity has changed the rules of the game has to do with probably the main theme of Donniel's talk, which is the issue of identity. And this issue of identity is, again, extremely important for Muslims today and extremely vexing for Muslims today, because Muslims are constantly asking themselves, how do we define ourselves? What is the Muslim identity? Is it a political identity? Is it a cultural identity? Is it an ideology? Are we defined by our religious communities? Now, today, the idea of defining Muslims as a religious community and as a separate, unique individual community is extremely strong, extremely important, because Muslim minorities in the West, in the United States and in Europe, have to sort of separate themselves from the majority in order to be noticed politically, and also to assert themselves and feel a sense of their own belonging within a particular value structure. However, this creates problems. Before modern times, in the Islamic world, religious minorities were categorized at what was called in Arabic millah. The term in Turkish is millet. And what a millah is a self-contained community defined along religious lines. It was an autonomous community politically. So, for example, if you were living under the caliphate of the Abbasids in Baghdad in, say, the 900s, and you happened to be a Christian, you would be living in a community that was to a large extent independent of the community around you, the community of Muslims around you. You would be governed by your Christian laws. You would have an ecclesiastical body which acted as your representatives and also ruled you in most cases. And the only time that you really had to do anything with Muslims collectively would be if there'd be, say, a dispute in business or something of that sort, which brought you to a Muslim court. Same thing with the Jews. And by the way, it was not too different in medieval Europe if you happened to be a minority in medieval Europe. And this was carried out through the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was organized into millets. And many Muslims today feel that the answer to their identity problems as minorities in European or American societies have to do with reconstituting some sort of an independent religious community, a millet of their own here today. A half-Ghanaian philosopher by the name of Kwame Anthony Appiah at Princeton University calls this model millet multiculturalism. It's a form of multiculturalism where people go against the idea of the melting pot by trying to have individual communities that have, to a certain extent, their own separate customs and their own separate laws. Usually when Muslims ask for this, they're asking for separate laws with regard to personal status, marriage, inheritance, things like that. Now, there are some problems with this. First of all, in the United States, for those of you who've studied the American political system, the American Constitution, the whole American political and legal culture, this is a culture where the rights that are given to people are given primarily as individuals and secondarily as groups. So this type of identity politics would not work as easily in the United States as it might in some countries of Europe, or, for example, in Canada. However, there are also other problems for Muslims themselves that many Muslims don't consider. If our identity is a collective identity defined as a Muslim millet, what are you going to do about Shia versus Sunni? Are the Shia supposed to have their own group and the Sunnis are supposed to have theirs? Or, for that matter, within the Shia themselves, what about the Ismaili Shia as opposed to the Imami or Twelver Shia, the Ismailis who follow the Aga Khan? Should you divide them into another subgroup? Or what happens with the Sunnis? Some Muslims are Sufis, some Muslims dislike Sufis. So are the Sufis and the non-Sufis supposed to be in different millets? And then what do you do with the groups, say, like the Ahmadis, the Qadianis, who consider themselves Muslims but aren't considered by other Muslims to be Muslims? You see, the problems get more and more and more and more complex. And what happens, especially in this country, is we keep falling back on this issue of individual expression and individual rights. Some time ago, I think it went out of business maybe 10 years ago, but back in the 80s and 90s, there was a newsletter and eventually almost a newspaper that was produced by American Muslim converts that was called The American Muslim. And their sort of their tagline, their subtitle under the American Muslim was Muslims by conviction. And what they were trying to say is that American convert Muslims are people who have made an individual choice to embrace Islam as a form of spirituality. They're not born into a pre-formed community. They didn't come from Pakistan or India or Morocco or Egypt or Syria or a place like that. That too creates its problems. Because a Muslim by conviction, someone who comes to Islam by conviction, also can leave Islam by conviction. And so now we have this issue of apostasy, and I think many of you have been following the news about the case of this American Muslim girl from Sri Lankan background who has converted to Christianity and who claims that her family wants to kill her, and she's gone and taken refuge with a fundamentalist Christian minister and his family, and I believe it's in Florida, if I remember right. Now, the whole problem of apostasy is one of these modern issues that was not faced in the past. In the first 120 years of Islam after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, the way you would become a Muslim if you wanted to convert to Islam is you couldn't convert individually and simply say, I want to be a Muslim, I'm going to make the Shahada and join Islam. What you had to do in those days is you had to actually find an Arab, literally an Arab, and you'd have to tell the Arab that you want to convert to Islam. And the Arab says, this is good. And then the Arab would have to invite you into his tribe formally to become a client and fictitious member of an Arab tribe. That's the way to convert. As you can imagine, there weren't very many converts to Islam in the first 120 years of Islam. This is rather difficult because what it meant is that you had to cut yourself off from your community completely, leave behind everything you knew before, become part of another community, literally join it and take that community's name. I know of only one case today where this actually happened. Back when I was in college as a graduate student, I had a colleague as a graduate student who was an anthropologist who did his work with one of the last Bedouin tribes of the Sudan, and he converted to Islam at the time, and he actually became a member of the tribe in the same way. He left behind his American name. He took the name Muslim Muhammad. The tribe was the Rashidi, and so now his official name is Muslim Muhammad al-Rashidi. And he continues to this day to act as a member of the tribe. Anytime somebody from the Rashidi tribe comes to visit him, you know, he has to have his house open, and they can stay at his house like any other tribal member. Now, this is the culture that's behind the infamous prohibition of apostasy that one finds in Islamic law. Back in those days, in the Middle Ages, when a Muslim would leave Islam, or a Christian would leave Christianity, or a Jew would leave Judaism, you would not simply convert as an individual. You would cut yourself off from your own community so as to be completely dead to your community. You would lose your identity entirely because you had no identity other than a collective identity. You would join another group. Therefore, when you understand this cultural background, you can see how these medieval laws on the Muslim side, thinking about a person who apostatized and left Islam for Christianity or another religion, would be a sort of traitor. That's how the Christians thought of Christian converts. That's how the Jews would have thought of Jewish converts. That's how the Muslims thought of Muslim converts. I know a case from my own research in Morocco about someone who was an Italian who converted to Islam in the 16th century, went over to Morocco. He was a merchant. He could never go back and deal with European merchants again because if he did, they would capture him and execute him. It's exactly the same. Now, today, we can't do this. Modernity does not allow us to do this. And so this also, the realization of this lies behind the protests of this girl's parents that, you know, she became a Christian. She has the right to be a Christian. They said, we're not going to kill her. We're not going to persecute her. She can be whatever she wants. Just come back to her family. This is a family that has accepted modernity. I'm sure they're not happy about what she did, but they're being, at least they sound pretty reasonable. On the other hand, when you have people on Fox News, as I saw this morning, who are saying that Islam automatically has a death penalty and is going to kill any apostate, anybody who converts to another religion, These, not the family from Sri Lanka, but these people, these Americans who are saying it, they're the ones who are being medieval. They forget, too, that Muslims are part of modernity. And so it's a struggle for all of us. Again, this is a struggle with all religious boundaries. And so it strikes every one of us in very similar ways. So it comes down to this point. Myself, as a person who converted to Islam from the Anglican Church, getting close to 40 years ago now, I too was a Muslim by conviction. I too made it as an individual choice. I am very much a creature of modernity, and this is something that I can't leave behind. And yet when I think of my own identity as a Muslim, I can only think of my identity in terms of the decision I made. What brought me to Islam? It's a certain kind of spirituality. And so I think one of the challenges, and if I read Donniel correctly, he's saying this too, what makes a Jew is performing the requirements, the mitzvot of what it means to be a Jew, and again, not having a diffuse spirituality, but a spirituality that's grounded in your tradition, that is really part of what makes you you. And what I often say to Muslims is that this is what Muslims should be thinking about as well. It's not what you dress like. It's not what language you speak. It's not what ethnic mosque you may go to if you're living in the city of Chicago. All right? It's what you believe. And so I'll end up with another quotation from Fritjof Schroen. He wrote a book that was called, Spiritual Realities and Human Facts. And the last line of the book, he says, "He who lives in prayer does not live in vain." That, to me, I think, is what's really essential for all three of our traditions. And to the extent that we share that sense of the essentiality of the spiritual in prayer, this is one reason why we're able to interact with each other and be friends the way we are.
So they come up here, or do you go down the aisle? They come up here. Since all of these things are recorded and you thus enter history with your question, we need you to come to the microphones. There are 2 microphones. If you have a question, come forward and please read it from the little card. Here comes somebody. I'm checking to see how small his handwriting is.
I can't read without my glasses.
Okay.
Rabbi Hartman, I think the problem of modernity goes deeper than you've analyzed it. I think, as James Carroll pointed out, the essence of modernity is secularism. That there is no God, or if there is a God, he's not a personal God. And if there is a personal God, he doesn't care whether a Jew remains a Jew or not. Until Jewish leaders are willing to actually deny this universally and affirm that there is a personal God who cares that Jews remain Jews, I don't see a solution to the problem of
We got to
Jews.
have your question, though. You can't make
Okay.
speeches.
Sorry, that's all. And until they address the question of why a God would care about me personally as an individual remaining a Jew, I don't think they'll answer. They will solve the problem.
Okay, Donniel, you want to?
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question. It might indeed be a deeper analysis of modernity or the challenges of modernity than my presentation. But when I look at the Jewish community, I don't think that's the major problem we're facing. I also don't, I hear a lot of that conversation. I don't see or I haven't participated in the death of faith. I know there's a lot of conversation about it, at least not in North America. I'm in the midst of a significantly believing people. In my own experience as a teacher, I have found that the problem is not whether people believe in a personal God or not, or whether God wants them to be Jewish, but rather whether being Jewish is important. See, and maybe I'm biased because that's what I learned from the Bible. See, in the Bible, everybody knew there was a God, and everybody ignored that God, because idolatry was more compelling. The question wasn't whether God exists. The question was whether Judaism as a vehicle for living with God was something that I find compelling and meaningful. So I don't doubt that that modernity or that the challenge of secularism. In other words, my presentation today, and as any time, whenever you make a presentation, you also make choices of what not to speak about. So I didn't speak about modernity and the challenges of science. And I didn't speak about modernity and the challenges of faith. In the Jewish community, I don't believe that either of them are the major challenge that we're facing. I think it's coming from somewhere else. Now, that doesn't mean that that your question is not, it's extremely valid, and it is indeed a challenge. But in the world see, it's not so much whether God exists that's going to be the key to a Jewish identity. See, I come from a people who are a very stiff-necked people, as the Bible says, who, whether God exists or not, doesn't move us that much. Or what God wants doesn't move us so much, unless what God wants is something that we buy into. And in modernity, our buying into the message of Judaism, its content, and not its author, is, from my perspective, the primary challenge. That's why I made that choice of speaking on this level. And amongst the Jews who I meet the percentage of Jews who go to synagogue on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and pound away. I don't know if some of you aren't familiar. The essence of the Yom Kippur service is something called the vidui. How do I say vidui in English? The confession, where you stand before God and there's lists of sins. I have sinned before thee. Ashamnu, bagadnu, gazalnu. I have acted deceitfully. All people pounding away and asking for forgiveness for God for the sins that they have committed. Believing that God cares, and believing that in doing so they will achieve atonement and a life next year, without in any way thinking about what they have to do the minute they leave services on Yom Kippur. So it might be so for other faith communities, but I don't believe that the boogeyman of secularism, of faithlessness, is not the primary challenge, I believe, which our people are living with. And in general, I feel that the way you market faith and God is through what that life means and what that life entails. And whether God wants it unto itself is never sufficient. It's how it changes my life that's most sufficient. And that's why I made the choice of focusing on that challenge of modernity.
Thank you. As a fruitful exchange, is somebody else ready, please?
This is to all of you, but is there a difference between the prophetic religions, of which all your traditions represent, and modernity in regards to purpose? By that I mean, what is the call, or the old notion of vocation, of these Abrahamic religions? To what end do these religions point? And does that help inform us, inspire us as religious people in our identity, our morality, and our praxis, our actions in modern society?
Thank you. All three on.
Profound statement embodied in that question. Thank you for it. And I speak as a Christian, although I recognize what I'm about to say as, in my understanding, true of the three traditions represented here, which is that the purpose of our revealed religion, the purpose of our being as we have it from our revealed religion, is, in the language of the tradition, to know, love, and serve God in this world, and to be happy with God in the next. And the knowledge and love and service of God in this world is essentially knowledge and love and service of the neighbor. And I would just say that that traditional answer to the question purpose, vocation, as I understand it, is essential to know and name God, immediately to be critical of the impulse to know and name God, because God is unknowable and unnameable, which is the essential conundrum. It's the great contradiction and the great insight of the biblical tradition, as I understand it, that this God who knows us by name and who invites us to know God by name cannot be named and cannot be known. Which goes to the prior observation question about secularism. The secular critique of religion comes from religion. The secular impatience, the atheist's impatience with the language about God that religious people use, that impatience itself comes from the biblical tradition. Christians and Jews in the Roman Empire were regarded as atheists. They were not at home in the language of the empire about the Holy One. So we are here to know, to name, to love, to serve God in this world, which is only knowing and loving and serving the neighbor. And, as we say, to be happy with God in the next world. What is all of this? This is the language of metaphor, in my tradition, of sacrament, of symbol. Language itself is symbolic, because what we're talking about is beyond language. And the most beautiful emblem of that is the biblical prohibition, true for all three of our traditions, against idolatry. And the refreshing call to return to that prohibition that we get today is the call from atheists who criticize the glib, shallow language about God that so many religious people use.
Vincent?
Yeah, the Quran says, Allahu yad'u ila dari salami wa yahdi man yasha'u ila siratin mustaqim. God calls to the abode of peace and guides whom he wishes to the straight way. What that tells me is that my primary responsibility as a Muslim is to get right with God. And if someone is interested in learning about Islam and comes to me and asks me about the religion, I'll tell them. And if someone is interested in becoming a Muslim, I'll help them. But if one doesn't come to me, I'm not going to be what in LA Muslims called a dawah commando and go out and stand on the corner of MacArthur Park with a Quran the way some people stand with the Bible. Because the most important thing to do is to be right with God in my own life. One of the problems with political Islam is that political Islam misses a very, very important point. In fact, it misses the most important point. And this is what I tell all the political Islamists. Imagine you get what you want, Imagine you get the whole world Muslim. If all the Christians convert and all the Jews convert and all the Hindus convert and all the Buddhists convert and everybody becomes Muslim, that victory will not help any one of you to get to heaven. Because it's about, again, the first question was about a personal relationship with God. It's about that too in Islam. It's about the relationship between the individual and God and what it takes to get to the abode of peace. This verse is also important to me because I don't only think of the abode of peace as after death. The abode of peace is where we live right now. It's peacefulness within myself, contentment, knowledge that I'm doing the best that I can. Getting right by God brings peace. Peace with my family, peace with my co-workers, peace with everybody I coexist with. To me, that's the message. That is what is the call of Islam. And also, it's important to remember that the proselytization, the missionary activity of Muslims began at the time of the Prophet and was very intense at the time of the coming of the Prophet and creating community around him. But for much of Islamic history, Muslims took verses like these and realized that it was God's choice to make the believer. It's not the person who wants to convert the believer. It's not that choice. It's God's choice. And so God will make people come to a religion in any way they can. In China, most of the Muslims came to Islam as orphans, children of prostitutes, who were abandoned by the Han Chinese, picked up by Chinese Muslims, adopted into their families, and raised as Muslims. Most Chinese Muslims today are, not in Western China, but on the sort of the coast of China, in areas like Guangzhou and the port cities of China. They come from those backgrounds. God brings people in God's own way.
We only have about 2 minutes, and I see we have a nice array of folk here, but I think we're going to have to quit after this. So will you take the last 2 minutes, please? The question was to all three of the prophetic religions.
Just first of all, it's a good opportunity in the context of a interfaith learning, I don't know if, and discussion, is that the Jewish tradition is not a prophetic tradition. The prophets were only one small voice in the Jewish tradition. First of all, the Bible continues to exist. We don't see Judaism only through the eyes of the prophets. In addition to that, the vast majority of Judaism has nothing to do either with the Bible or the prophets. The weight, 90% of Judaism as we know it today, comes out of the oral rabbinic tradition. And so now, if I would then translate that, is there a difference between the Jewish tradition and modernity, etc.? And I'll go back to something that Jim was saying before, and of course there is. There's a lot of new things that we've learned in modernity. There's a lot of ideas about pluralism, the value of humankind independent of race, religion, gender, financial position, nationality. There are so many new moral advancements and ideas that we've learned that together, we've been born into what you say, Vince, the original sin of modernity. Together with the original sin of modernity is that modernity is not just a saint with, is not just a healthy dog. It also has much saintliness in it. And so there are parts of tradition that can be adapted. There are parts in which modernity defines or demands a readaptation of tradition. But at the end of the day, and this is what my talk attempted to speak about, is that modernity is not necessarily redefining solely the content of religion. Modernity is not a counter-knowledge, a new truth over and against religious truths. And how do we live with the two together? How do I accept, creationism? Like, what do I do? What curriculum do I use in my schools? For the Jewish community, that isn't, modernity for us is not that conflict. We don't have those conflicts. And as part of what I'm going to be speaking about later, the whole notion of interpretation is so essential to the Jewish tradition that the meaning of Judaism is something that has always evolved. So conflicts of truth. We never thought that the world was actually created in 7 days. So it's not like that the rabbis say, we don't know how it was created. It's like, I don't know, you think this is the way it was created? It's like, the creation story, the Bible was never meant to be a book of physics and biology. That's not what it was meant to be, and therefore we don't have those counter-truths. That's not what challenges us in modernity. What modernity challenges us, and I hear it, by the way, I think in your question as well, is that are we really, as religious people, serious about our endeavor? Or has modernity created a context in which so much mediocrity is allowed to penetrate into our religious discourse? Are we, you spoke about, are we passionate about religion at the same time that we're pluralists? Do we still have truths that we're willing to live by, that we're willing to get up in the morning and say, yes, this is going to require of me a commitment of time and of energy and of focus? We could spend all of our time focusing on modernity's truths and forget that at the essence, and this is my two colleagues, religion at its essence is a commitment to walk in a certain way. And are we as equally committed to doing that in the midst of this new world that we live in? And if we don't say yes, then religion will just become some superficial conversations, superficial symbolic things. Very often the more superficial it's going to get, the more judgmental we're going to be of other people. We're going to focus on, there's a very important term in Judaism, it's called narishkeit. It's a Yiddish term. We'll focus on the little things and we'll fight about the little things. But the larger, can we still be, or can we still survive in modernity with that larger vision? And the answer is we can. But at the end of the day, the choice is in our hands. Thank you.
You thank Rabbi Hartman and colleagues.